This government does not have many economic successes to shout about. So when it set a target of halving inflation a year ago, the government is claiming that the fact inflation has more than halved shows that their plan is working. This week we've had new figures published showing that annual inflation has stayed constant in January. Jeremy Hunt's response has been to reiterate that the plan is working and that they've made huge progress. As I've pointed out in other videos, I don't have the same faith in their plan. The plan is that if inflation can just get back to 2%, then everything will be all right. High interest rates choke the economy in order to get inflation down, and this particularly hits the poor. Advocates of this approach consider that inflation is such a wicked problem that it has to be the focus. In effect, I think they're saying that collateral damage is a necessary evil to get the economy back on track for the future. However, I just do not believe that this blinkered obsession to get inflation to 2% at all costs is even based on any kind of economic logic, given the evidence of years of such policies. The Bank of England itself points out that the full effect of increased interest rates takes 18 to 24 months to work through. This means that interest rates are a really blunt and non-responsive policy tool. In the current climate, with significant risks from war and even future pandemics, who knows what's going to happen in the next couple of years? In its latest monetary report, the Bank of England is predicting that inflation will be above the target of 2% until 2027, when it's forecast to be 1.9%. A little aside here, the bank actually predicts that inflation may get down to 2% for a little while this year, but then go back up again. This is a purely mathematical phenomenon in the way that the figures are calculated. Nevertheless, this didn't stop Jeremy Hunt claiming that inflation will fall to 2% in the next few months. Let's just continue that quote that we saw earlier. After saying that the plan is working, he highlights the Bank of England forecast that inflation will fall around 2% in a matter of months. He doesn't mention that it will be very temporary. Just a little bit of dishonesty here. What's really important is that the Bank of England's forecast of inflation achieving the target of 2% in 2027 is actually conditioned on a number of critical assumptions. Notice that one of these assumptions is that oil and gas prices will fall in a nice linear fashion each year until 2027. Listen, it's not impossible that this is exactly what will happen, but I think that there's a high risk that this is a really optimistic scenario. I'm not the only person that thinks this. There are 9 members of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee that makes decisions on interest rates. One of its members, Catherine Mann, thinks that inflation isn't going to hit 2% soon. She highlighted a number of upside risks for inflation in a recent speech. First, she pointed out that services inflation is still persisting. In January, it was 6.5%, slightly up from the December figure. There doesn't seem to be any downward pressure in this. She shows these graphs to indicate that the same phenomenon doesn't appear to be happening in either the US or the euro area. You can see in these charts that there's a bigger gap between services inflation, shown by the purple line, and general inflation, shown by the blue line. Second, she highlighted how companies are passing through cost increases, particularly in consumer-facing services, in order to rebuild profit margins, and that this may continue for a while. There's still quite high inflation in some services, 7.3% in health, 8.5% in communication, 7% in restaurants and hotels. There is here an opportunity for businesses to push up prices at the moment. We're all used to seeing big jumps, and companies may be taking advantage of this to restore profits. Thirdly, she points to the upside risk to shipping and insurance costs associated with the Red Sea turmoil. And of course, this could get worse if the war in the Middle East or Ukraine worsened. Interesting how we've seen in the press about a tea shortage due to disruption in the Red Sea recently. Overall, I think she's right in highlighting the possibility of new upward inflation shocks, and raising the alert that this could exacerbate upside inflation momentum. The simple statements of Hunt and Sunak, "The plan is working," just seem naive compared to these risks. "If everything goes our way, we'll achieve our inflation target in 2027. This is effectively what they're saying. Fingers crossed economics. It's interesting to reflect on how the Monetary Policy Committee makes its decisions. There are 9 members and they all vote on what should happen to interest rates. The latest vote was that 6 said rates should be maintained, 1 said reduce rates, and 2 said increase. The fact that these experts can't agree is indicative of how little certainty there is about any of this. There's another point here. The UK government, as with many Western governments, are absolutely wedded to economic theories that suggest inflation targeting is the way to ensure low inflation. For the decade leading up to COVID, we had low inflation. Governments believed that they were controlling inflation, but it appears that they weren't. Energy prices are what's controlled inflation in the past few years. Why is this going to be any different going forward? I'm not the only one who thinks this. The UN organisation dealing with trade, UNCTAD, in its most recent annual report had a piece on the fact that 2% inflation targets have become almost orthodox economic policy. They point out that the 2% target is actually an arbitrary figure based on a series of assumptions, as is the case with many economic theories. They say that, on average, there is no evidence that inflation targeting improves performance as measured by inflation, output or interest rates. Further, the UNCTAD report states that often the rate of inflation has been decreasing independently of whether these countries adopted an inflation target or not, while employment gains have generally not materialised. This is unambiguous. Inflation targeting doesn't work. It's a very credible argument and definitely is worth some serious reflection on how our economic policy is wedded to this approach. The report also points out that there's a steep cost of inflation targeting through high interest rates in terms of inequality and damaged investment prospects. The key point is that the UK economy is in a mess. Low growth, low productivity, terrible poverty and inequality. Nobody can claim that UK economic policy is working. I think that these points have real validity. Now, there are some economists who definitely will disagree with me, but I think we need a proper detailed review of what alternatives there may be to this narrow inflation targeting approach. To be honest, I just don't have any faith that our politicians really understand the complexity of these issues, which is why they're able to make such naive comments. The plan is working? Ridiculous. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd be really grateful for that. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.